important thing you should know about our next speaker is not that he's a VMI graduate, not that he is one of only 3 people in SAC to ever be awarded the Air Force Cross for linebacker 2, but that he has brought his fiancée, Patricia McCarthy, to this event. Patricia, please stand and be welcomed. This is a short introduction. I present the most newly engaged member of the Strategic Air Command, Russ McCarthy.
Thank you, Rob, for that kind introduction. And, you know, speaking of Jack Cheney, as you were there, I want to tell you a true story about this man. He and I both arrived at the Pentagon at the same time as action officers and directed of plans. And after we knew each other, we played bridge together and golf together. And the first time that he became eligible below the zone for lieutenant colonel, he was not picked. And Jack was convinced that that was the end of his military career. Somehow he had screwed up royally. He was going to retire. He was going to fly the airlines, whatever. But somehow his military career was over. And this just goes to show you, never lose hope, because even a fighter pilot can become commander of Strategic Air Command. Now, General Daugherty said some remarks this morning, and I have to correct them. First of all, he said I'm wearing a toupee, and that's correct, because under this really is a tremendous head of hair. But because some of you have lost your hair, I decided to try to be more like you. Now, I want to tell you another story about General Daugherty. When I left Guam, I came up to SAC headquarters, and the person, I was assistant to Dick Cody, who was Chief of Staff Personnel, and at that time, just before I got there, SAC had decided, in their infinite wisdom, that they could save $200 million by stopping one computer system for personnel and starting a new one. Somebody said, hey, that's a good idea, we'll save a lot of money. Well, about 3 months later, we didn't know who we had, where they were located, who was eligible for promotion, and on and on. So one day, Saturday morning, General Daugherty called, and General Cody was out, and he said, Russ, I want you to go to the computer room, and I want you to get my computer printout. I said, yes, sir. He said, don't have them change a thing? Bring it up. Yes, sir. Went up, and he says, this is very interesting, Russ. It says, your computer says that I'm a dog handler. I'm not rated. I have no awards and decorations. I have no overseas time. I think we do have a problem with your computer. Now, the word of this quickly spread, and any time that General Cody found out that the personnel computer was going to be talked about at the staff meeting, he arranged to go TDY. So this perception continued. And about a month later, General Daugherty called up again and he says, Russ, I want you to go to your computer and I want you to pull this thing up and let's see if we've improved. And so he says, don't have anybody change it, don't have anybody look at it. We did. He brought it up and he says, well, this is very interesting. It seems that I'm a flight nurse. And he would think after 15 years, at least I could be a senior flight nurse, but no, I'm just a plain flight nurse. Well, that went out to the field. And so every wing commander in SAC would call up and say, McCarthy, your damn computer is shorting me this, that, and the other. Well, to top this off, I knew I was coming up eligible for BG. The board had met, so I went in and you could check your records, and I did. And I went in and looked at my computer runout. It had listed none of my awards and decorations. It had listed none of my overseas time. And I said, good God, I've been screwed up by the Air Force computer. And I went home very dejected, and General Daugherty had called a staff meeting, and he said, words to the fact, well, we're really going to, this computer business is getting out of hand. So he called, and I thought, oh, God, here we go. I'm going to be drummed out of SAC. Well, he announced at that staff meeting that I had been promoted. But the one thing I will never forget is he says, Russ, you come with me. And he went into his office, and he says, you sit at my chair, and you make the phone calls to tell your family that you've been promoted. And, sir, I will never forget that. That, to me, was something that, at least, if nothing else, I got to sit at the Sink's chair and use his telephone. And so, General, thank you very much. Now, I had taken this speech, and Miss Patricia there had helped me for 2 weeks to hone 2 hours of information down to 45 minutes. But after I heard Earl Peck and what he said, I said, Patricia, we went back to the room and we tore this thing up, And so what you're going to hear isn't what I prepared, but I think it's important. But before we get started, there's some people I want to introduce to you. The first guy I want to introduce is the first guy that was shot down on the B-52, and it was our first POW during Linebacker 2, Bob Certain. Bob, stand up. And for those that don't know it, Bob, after he came back, he became an Episcopal minister and has a very outstanding congregation. The last man that was shot down, or the last airplane, was Jim Condon. Jim, would you stand up? Jim and I go back a long way. We were in B-47s together at Lake Charles, and by the way, besides being a POW, he is very famous in Lake Charles for an incident that only he and I will share to tell his blackmail money runs out. Then I will share it with the rest of you. But he is very famous for a specific incident that happened at the Columbia Club in downtown London. I'll leave it with that. Now, another individual I want to introduce you to was a young captain when I took over the Air Division at Blytheville in 1975, and he was my first aide ever. He was a young captain, and I'm glad to see he did well, because now he's Lieutenant General Bob Henson, the Vice Commander of Strategic Command. Bob, please stand up and take a bow. I can take pride in saying I taught him well. Now, as I say, this particular speech is we're going to, I'm not sure how the timing is going, but Patricia's going to give me some hand signals, and when I'm out of time, well, I'm out of time. Okay, next slide, please. I looked at something to try to figure out how we could sum up what Linebacker 2 had to do with strategic aviation, and this gentleman sitting over here is far better than I am. So these are General Doherty's remarks, and I'll give you a second to read that, or a minute, I guess, to read it. Now, you notice General Doherty wrote that on 22 May 1997, and actually this is an excerpt from a book review he wrote, of a book review for us on the book that Bob Rayfield and I brought called B-52s over Hanoi. And I think he could sum it up a lot better than I could. Now, when I was trying to look for something that sort of zeroed in on what Linebacker did strategically for the Vietnam War specifically, this is what I came up with. Now, I'd like to read this to you. Although you can read it, there's some emphasis that needs to be put on the right syllable. Sir Robert Thompson, for those of you that don't know, was a very noted British historian. He was noted for his objectivity. He was knighted by the Queen, and he wrote a book called The Lessons of Vietnam. And basically, the first two words, in my view, on December 30th, 1972, after 11 days of those B-52 attacks on Hanoi, you had won the war, it was over, and within my heart, I believe that was absolutely true, as did most of the crew members who were out there. They had, talking about the North Vietnamese, fired 1,242 SAMs. They had none left, and what could have come in overland from China would have been a mere trickle. They and their whole rear base area at that point were at your mercy. They would have taken any terms, and this is why, of course, you actually got a peace agreement in January, which you were not able to get in October. Notice that figure, 1,242. That was from Russian intelligence. We know that was the exact number of SAMs that were fired. We did not have sensors that could tell us how many SAMs were fired, because at the last, they were firing them off without putting their radars up like Roman candles, which the Russians were really complaining about. But that figure followed away because it comes important later on in the briefing. Next slide. Now, two people that are responsible for a lot of the material that's here are two people I want to introduce. Many of you know Dr. Bob Rayfield, or Colonel Bob Rayfield. He was a speechwriter for many sinks, including General Holloway and General Doherty. After he retired, he went out. He had a very distinguished career as a professor at the University of California. And the other one is Dr. Albert Atkins. And I'd like to, first of all, Bob, stand up, please, so they see who you are. Dr. Bob Rayfield. The other is Dr. Albert Atkins. He is a professor of Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University at Riverside, California. And you'll see a little bit about him later. Next slide, please. Now, the two books we wrote, on Linebacker 2 was, first of all, the first one was to preserve the history of Linebacker 2 as best we could. About 2 months after Linebacker 2 was over, we had the head of PA for DOD came out, and I can't remember his name, but he said, as we were riding around the car, he said, Colonel, he said, you could do the Air Force a great service if you would write something down as you remember it about what happened here on Guam during Linebacker 2. He says, if you will do this for us, I will promise you I'll get an author of note who will come behind you and write a book for the general public. And I said, fair enough. And so in 75, I started this book. And the first one was, my co-author was Lieutenant Colonel George Allison, who was my executive officer at the time at the division. And Bob Rayfield here was the editor at that time. And we wrote it as a monograph, part of the monograph series. We tried to write it like a historical novel, and we had tried to document it like a thesis. In the back of the bibliography, there were secret and top secret documents that were used by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff when he went over to visit, to brief the president, members of Congress, message traffic between Joint Chiefs, SAC, TAC, and PACAF headquarters and 8th, and also unit histories, and also some things on the ECM manuals. And the idea of it, we got all that declassified so people could come behind us and expand the envelope. That first book was written specifically for air crew members, for people at the Air University, for future planners. In other words, it was written more for an audience of Air Force people. Second book, in my personal opinion, the people who were killed, a lot of them were under my command, and their families never were told, in my opinion, the outstanding job that their families did and the ultimate sacrifice they paid to help free our prisoners of war. And I took it as a moral responsibility to write the book. And I tried to write it in terms that everybody could understand. We took out a lot of the acronyms. We've added a lot of additional first-hand accounts from not only the crews, but maintenance and supply and those other support personnel. This particular book, Bob was a co-author, but he was also responsible for getting the publisher, which was the University of California. He convinced them that this book had merit as a historical document, and he was able to convince them to do it. We got it published. Shortly thereafter, unfortunately, they sold their publishing business, and so right now the book is out of print, but we're going to try to get it back in print. Next slide. Now, there are things I could not put in the book, but before I explain that, you need, for those of you that weren't involved in Linebacker 2, you needed to know how the campaign unfolded. And the plan was for the first 3 days that we'd come in over the northwest of Hanoi, over Thud Ridge, come downtown Hanoi, drop our bombs, do a 45-degree turn to get out of the SAM threat area as soon as we could. And the tactics were that we would separate the bomb streams so that they would be bombed all night. Then the fighter bombers and the F-105s, the F-111s would come in and keep them up during the day. What the idea is, after 3 days, they would be so groggy that they would be sort of defenseless. Sounds good on paper, but it didn't work in practice. And what happened is, the first night, I was, Tom Rue, who was the commander of the 72nd Bomb Wing. We had 2 bomb wings at Guam. He had all the Gs, 100 G models. He was selected to fly the first night, and General Anderson, the division commander, asked me to brief the first night, which I did. And so I briefed the mission, and he says, you will brief the second day, and you'll fly the second day as Airborne Mission Commander. So when the frag came in after the first group had taken off, I noticed we had the same route, the same altitudes, and the same headings and same everything. And General Johnson, who was commander of 8th Air Force at the time, was off station, but his vice was Charlie Bennett, Major General, and Charlie and I were very good friends. And I went up to 8th and I said, Charlie, closed the door. I says, sir, can I talk to you personally? And he said, yeah, go ahead. He says, this is stupid. We're going down the same routes, same altitude, same headings. We're going to kill a lot of people. And we shouldn't do that. He says, I understand what you're saying. Your thoughts will be noted. Now stand at attention, Colonel. You've got your orders. Now go fly the mission as ordered. And I did. We were lucky. We didn't lose a single plane that mission. Third night, same plan. Well, we got hosed, and they cleaned our clock, and the loss rates were such that we could not stand those, or we'd have to call Linebacker 2 off. So that's what happened the first 3 nights. Now, with that as a setting, let me tell you about the golden basketballs. There was a courier plane that flew from around Utapao to Karat, around to the Philippines, to Guam, and then up to PACAF headquarters. And we received, right after that third night, there's 2 big basketballs painted gold, and somebody had taken an old tennis net and they put it around it. And I'll put this as delicately as I can, but the sign said, you buff guys have got private parts as big as these, sign the fighter jocks, and I want to say they came from karate. I'm not sure that's true, Jack, but anyway, came from some base. But that sort of helped morale a little bit. About the same time, a senior officer from PACAF arrived, and he says, McCarthy, I want you to tell your crews that when this thing is over with, we are going to make sure that these buff crews get more than their fair share of awards and decorations for the job they're doing. Now hold that thought for a minute. By the way, the first B-52 in the Hanoi area was not linebacker 2 or linebacker 1. It was a single B-52 escorted by 6 F-4s, and the purpose of this mission was to go in and take actual radar photographs of the targets that we would use during linebacker 2. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, the RNs know that when you go against a target you haven't seen before, you make radar predictions, and from that you hope that your predictions closely match what you got, and therefore your bombs get close to the target. But when you have actual radar photographs of what you're going after, you can make your bombing better and therefore minimize damage, collateral damage to other civilian structures. So the bombing accuracy we got and the minimizing of the collateral damage is due to this particular airplane, and the guy that was taking the scope photographs was a guy named Lieutenant Colonel Craig Cosby, an 8th Air Force planner, sharpest one I've ever met, worked with him during linebacker 1, and to this day, the reason it's not in the book is because we didn't know about it when the book was published, or we'd have put it in. Okay, I want to skip this third one for a minute and get back to awards and decorations. After linebacker 2 was over with, we got detailed instructions from PACAF on how these awards would be submitted and what we could submit to them. We put this package together. We got a task force of about 60 people from both the 43rd, which is the D wing, my wing, and the 72nd wing, and we listened to all the mission tapes. Every airplane that flew in linebacker 2 had a tape on board that taped all of the transmissions from both the interphone, radar, all the radar signals that that plane came in contact with, so we could pretty well reconstruct the mission. They put the package together, and I told my troops, you guys are the most objective as far as who gets what award. You submit it, and we could submit anything but except the Congressional Medal of Honor and the Air Force Cross, and that was reserved for our headquarters. This we did. We submitted to PACAF headquarters as a package, as they told us. About 6 months later, I asked what happened to it. I was told it is under consideration. 6 months more go by, get ready to go to SAC headquarters, and I get the same reply. About a year later from that, I was sitting in the officers' club at Andrews having a drink with a general officer, a friend of mine, who had been both a fighter pilot, a B-47 pilot, a B-52 pilot, had flown a tour downtown Hanoi in 105s, and had flown one in F-4s. So he knew both sides of the equation. And I said to him, you know, this isn't right. This isn't right that these guys did not receive these awards for which they were recommended, because in many cases it meant the difference between them being promoted or not, being selected for senior service school, and I feel that PACAF headquarters dropped the ball for whatever reason. And he says, Russ, I agree with you. Everything you say is absolutely right, but let me tell you the other side of the equation. He says, these guys now that are controlling these awards at PACAF headquarters are senior officers, and when they were junior officers flying 105s downtown Hanoi, they had to get 25 missions in before they got their Silver Star, and they were getting flak and everything else. And as far as the fighter mafia is concerned, these guys flying 11 days, and some of them only flying 4 or 5 days, they didn't do the same thing, and it's not going to be approved. Well, I'd heard about the fighter mafia, but I didn't pay much attention to it. But if you want to learn about the fighter mafia and how they feel about SAC, there is a very good book written by Tom Clancy and Lieutenant General Horner, who commanded all the air assets in Desert Storm. And he's not the least bit shy telling you about how he thinks about SAC and what SAC's role was in screwing up TAC in the Vietnam War. And I am told that when they announced that SAC was being disbanded at places like Langley, Luke, Davis, Moffett, and others, they had a giant celebration, and the fighter mafia, I am told, this is alleged, that they said, we have finally driven the last nail in the coffin of Strategic Air Command, and it will never do that to us again. Whether that is true or not, I don't know, but I sort of suspect that maybe part of it is. So anyway, the fact that a lot of you in this room did not get the awards and decorations you deserve, are not because we didn't try, but you can lay it right at the doorstep of Pacific Air Force headquarters because they're the ones that were responsible for it, and they did not approve it. Next slide. Okay, day 26. After the third day, there was a big discussion about these tactics. And to put it politely, we in the field and SAC headquarters had some very heated discussions about who had the best knowledge about how to do this. And we sort of suggested to SAC headquarters that in the field we were closer to the action and we had a better way of doing things than they sitting back here. And all due respect to you guys back here in SAC, y'all did a tremendous job. But after this heated discussion, they finally said, yes, we'll let you submit some suggestions. So we got all the crew members together. We had them that had flown it. We got the airborne mission commanders. We got the staffs. And they came up with some damn good ideas. We submitted to SAC. And I must say, SAC cooperated. They tasked the different units to go out and try these tactics against the SA-2 simulators we had at Nellis and also some we had down at Eglin. And through that, in 5 days, we literally rewrote the tactics manual for the B-52 and how it was employed, and it was a team effort for everybody concerned. Now, on day 8 was the 26th. These targets were the ones that were selected, and notice in the upper right-hand corner, you have SAM site VN549. That site was responsible for shooting down more B-52s than any other site we had, and the reason was it was manned by the Russians with equipment that our B-52s could not pick up or jam against. And so these are the targets that were listed for day 8. Now, since we've had lunch, we're going to make this audience participation. I want everyone who was involved with Linebacker 2, no matter whether they were flying, maintenance supply personnel, staff here or wherever, if you had anything to do actively with Linebacker 2, I ask that you stand at this time, please. I ask that we give them a round of applause. On behalf of a grateful nation, I thank you for the job you did. There's one other individual I want to ask to stand. This individual was an aircraft commander, did an outstanding job, and he was awarded the Air Force Cross during Linebacker 2. John Mize. Stand up, John. Okay, now, put these raids in perspective. At Anderson, we had 150 plus B-52s, which was the largest number of B-52s ever assembled in the history of Strategic Air Command. And we had on that base, by the way, a normal SAC wing was about 15 B-52s, B-15 135s, 2,500 to 3,000 people. Anderson, we had quarters to surge it to 4,000, but we had 12,000 people there when Linebacker 2 started. For example, when we first started the build-up, what we did, we took the base gym, filled it full of beds, and we had two guys were assigned to each bed. One guy worked 12 hours, the other guy slept, the other guy came back, he got in the bed, and the other guy worked 12 hours. We built 10 cities, and was wall-to-wall people, and it was quite an operation. Okay, getting back to mission. Here's the way the tactics went. We found that the G models did not have the effective ECM as the D models because the Ds had been designed for something else. So the Gs we sent against Haiphong. We had some waves going 2 ways across the target. Downtown Hanoi, we took 4 waves of D models from Anderson and Utapao, one coming in from the northwest, northeast, southeast, southwest at different altitudes. And the point was that to make these tactics work, we had to tighten the standards with which the crews had to fly. All of you remember that flew SAC missions before. The standard SAC time on target was plus or minus 3 minutes. So you had a 6-minute window to drop your bombs. In these particular targets, to be maximum effective, the time was cut to plus or minus 0. And the reason for it was this. Because these bomber streams, as they came downtown Hanoi, they flew over the top of each other. And if the high stream was late, they would literally bomb the low stream right out of the sky. And so there were these and a lot of other things that happened to make these things extremely complex. Now, because Utapao kept flying missions, I was directed to send 22 of my crews over to Utapao. So when we got to fly on day 8 with a max effort, I had to use every breathing body that was warm and could walk in the door. One of those individuals had his 4th mission as an aircraft commander. He had to go downtown Hanoi on these complex tactics, and he did it flawlessly. And I wish to God I could remember his name, but my God, he showed the spirit of the crews. Next target. Next slide, please. To support the 120 B-52s, we had that many KC-97, 135s, but 194 were assigned, and if you're lucky, you had 120 of them in commission at any one time, and those 120 flew 763 refueling sorties, which was a record refueling sorties for that time. They were supported by 113 support aircraft, and when you add the 120 B-52s, it says you had 233 aircraft in the skies over Hanoi that night. Next slide. Now it says other support aircraft besides Air Force. You notice we have Navy, Marines, and if I had enough room on the program, I would entitle this the finest hour of not only SAC, but the Air Force, the Navy, the Marine Corps, and others. And I want you to call your attention to the lower right-hand side. Others. There is an outfit called Air America that some of you are familiar with. But what some of you don't know is Air America, during Linebacker 2, had helicopters painted with markings of Chinese and North Vietnamese helicopters. They were manned by Asiatic crews that had on uniforms of North Vietnamese and Chinese people. They were on the ground 60 miles west of Hanoi and 40 miles north of Hanoi. And they had teams out. If any crew member had come in, they would have gone out and made arrangements to pick those people up and fly north, because by flying north, they were assumed to be friendly airplanes. They would land close to the Chinese border. There was these STOL airplanes, the platypuses, and we had arrangements to take the people back to Udorn. And although it didn't happen in Linebacker 2, a friend of mine who shot down in 105s did it, and the first thing he thought about when he crawled in that helicopter, my God, I'm going to be a prisoner of war in China. But he got home okay. Another outfit is called MACSOG. Earl Peck talked about it. He and I were both in MACSOG. And if you haven't heard of MACSOG, it means Military Assistance Command Vietnam Special Operations Group. And it was a cover name for conglomerations of Air Force, CIA, DIA, NISA, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, a whole bunch of people doing some very strange things. I'll give you two examples. One of the things they did, we had some ammunition manufactured in Kadena. These guys went in, teams of special forces went in. They went in and these ammunition piles that were going down the trail, what happened, a porter would bring them so far, he'd dump them that night, then the next day somebody else would pick them up and take them further. They went in and they salted this ammunition in among the regular ammunition. When the North Vietnamese soldier put that round in the chamber, pulled the trigger, it blew up in his face and killed him. As you might imagine, for quite a while, there was a reluctance on the part of the North Vietnamese to fire their weapons down south. And this obviously helped some lives. But the North Vietnamese had another thing we had going for us. They could not stand to have anybody in their territory that they couldn't control. And so my particular part of the operation was I had some Chinese nationals crews plus some others, and we would go down to the salvage yard and pick up some old blankets and some old bent-up guns, things that were not usable. Then we'd take a harness a parachute harness, soak it in cow's blood, and freeze it in a 100-pound block of ice. We'd dump this stuff in a known North Vietnamese division's area, and we'd send out a message saying, understand your supplies were scattered, you got one wounded, you're proceeding from point A to point B. We're sending in 4 more teams tomorrow to help you. And by doing this, there was nobody on the ground, but we know that there were 4 North Vietnamese divisions that were supposed to head south that were delayed up to 6 months looking for people that weren't there. That's what MACSOG did. And they received more Congressional Medal of Honor than any other unit in the history of our armed forces, and for what they did, they should have got twice as many. So that's part of the other that's there. Next slide, please. How am I doing on time, Patricia? Okay. Now, work in progress, Linebacker 2. This is the crew members who flew. Remember I said we got together to try to get these awards and decks, and the first thing we did was we took all the people who were Southeast Asia qualified in B-52s, and those who flew from Anderson, we listed the date they flew, the aircraft tail number by the last 4 numbers, the cell they flew in, the cell position, and that was the basis for identifying who flew what and to put these awards and decorations in. This particular list of crews, I submitted to SAC after I got through writing a book, and I says, hang on to this because this is the only one I know in existence. When SAC was disbanded, they sent this list down to Maxwell, and it was lost for 10 years. And there was Major Zinter, who I was helping on a thesis. he found this list, and tomorrow I'm presenting this list to the museum here. Next slide. We have a problem, however. And the problem is all the guys from Utapau aren't on that list because it was only made for Anderson. And I would challenge those of you who flew from Utapau that are here in the audience, if you've got some documentation that will prove who flew from Utapau, then I would ask that you submit it, and I'll show you how to do it in a minute. And my hope is that one of these days we'll have a complete list, at least, of everybody who flew and preserved this part of history of Linebacker 2. Next slide. The guy who has said he would help to do this is a Colonel Ron Thurlow, who, among other things, has written a complete history of every B-52 from the time it left the factory floor until it was either shot down, chopped up, had an aircraft accident, or still on active duty. And as far as I know, it's the only history I've seen, and he did, and as far as I know, he has no psych experience. But he has taken on the task. He says, if you've got information on this, he will try to put this list together. That's how you can contact him. Those of you that don't have a pen and paper, after the meeting, I'm going to be out in the next room. I'll be glad to give it to you. And I'm hoping someday we'll have this list. Next slide, please. Okay, Dr. Albert Atkins. I told Albert about a letter I received that said basically it was a Twix, and all the stuff was blacked out except the message, and it said basically a high-ranking North Vietnamese defector had defected, said if you had kept the bombing up for one more week, as Sir Albert Thompson said, we would have sued for terms on any peace. I told Albert, if you can prove that point, Albert, you're going to be a very famous professor, and the history books as we know them have to be rewritten. I'd taken that Twix, I sent it to a friend of mine in the CIA, and all the stuff on the top, you know, the numbers that only base communicators understood, to, from, and all that, that was blanked out. After 2 weeks, he called me back. He said, Russ, whoever did this was an expert. I think he probably worked for the CIA, but I'll give you my best guess. He says this message is probably an MI5 or MI6 debrief, and that was British or one of their equivalents. And he said if I had to guess, I'd tell you Britain, France, maybe Germany, Holland, or Belgium. I'd planned to take that Twix, and I had planned to take that and take it and put it in after I retired and pursue it and try to find another copy or somehow authenticate that. And if any of you happen to have a copy of that in your files, I would appreciate you sending it to me, and we'll give it to Albert, and he's going to take care of making the rest assured the general population knows about this incident. So this is his case study. Now, he's already had declassified from the Freedom of Information Act a CIA Twix that said basically in 1966, it said that the North Vietnamese and the Chinese were at each other's throats. And here's what happened. The Chinese had already had sappers and road construction crews in North Vietnam, and they offered the North Vietnamese some more. The North Vietnamese said, thank you very much, we don't want them. And the reason being they were afraid once the Chinese got in there, they couldn't get them out. So what they did is they started pulling their troops out, and there was some dissension. Now, you got to remember back in 1966, some of the senior officers will remember, there was a pissing contest going on between CIA, DIA, and the intelligence services, and CIA was sort of politicized, put it politely, and they weren't sharing a lot of their information. So whether that particular Twix ever got in the hands of military, I do not know. But I want to talk about the Director of War Plans. In my mind, this individual was the unsung hero of the Vietnam War. And all I'm going to say to him is, usually people in the Director of War Plans and Director of Plans that held this job, they were one-star generals. If they hacked it for 2 years, they usually got promoted to 3 or 4 stars. And many of our leaders of the Air Force cut their spurs in this particular position. This particular guy that was in it in October of '66, I'm going to call General M. And one of the deals back in those days, if you were going to take a paper to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and it was going to go down, no matter what office of primary responsibility, a plans action officer had to take that paper and do the final part of it. I inherited a paper called the PAL system, which is about the permissive action link that was how we control nuclear weapons through the NATO chain and through the National Military Command Authority. And this Director of War Plans had some very definite ideas of what he thought should be in that paper, so I spent a lot of time in there with him and writing what he said and trying to get it coordinated. And I was in there one day at lunchtime, and he says, Russ, have you ever played badminton? I said, no, sir, I play squash, handball, and racquetball, and I figured badminton is really for girls. He says, good, follow me. So we went down to the athletic center, got dressed, and he says, this is a badminton court, these are the lines, do the best you can. And then our opponent walked in, and it was either the number 2 or number 3 guy from McNamara at the time, and I cannot remember which one, and his aide. Anyway, I ran around the court for 30 minutes. We lost, which was the idea of the game. Then after we finished that, we went into the athletic center, and back in those days, they had a table in the corner, another table, and there was a spread between that and the other tables. And so this General M, and McNamara's number 2 or 3 guy, sat down, and the general politely said, look, the way you guys are trying to run this war is wrong. It violates every principle of war we know. This graduated, escalated response is not going to hack it. You're going to kill a lot of people, and there's going to be a lot of money and lives lost. If you're going to end this war, the way to do it is take those B-52s, you take them and you bomb every damn target in North Vietnam, and you bomb them until they say Uncle Ho. And if you want to end it, that's the way to do it. And he said, the guy listened politely and says, I understand what you're saying, General, but we're the boss, you're the workers, we think we know best, now do what we tell you. Now, this scene was repeated a couple more times. Fast forward to May of 67, there were a meeting of the 4 stars. It was called Corona Harvest, and there were papers that would be put out on what was going to be talked about or possible subjects, and one of them, and normally it had date, time, who was meeting, who was briefing, what the subject was, who was the OPR. But on this one entry, it said classified. And at the time, my job with General Clay was to take and coordinate all the Director of Plan Action Officer papers so he could review them before they went down there. The Director of War Plans at that time locked himself in his office, wasn't seeing anybody, and he went down to this conference. About 3 days later, when he came back, they relieved him of his job. He was put on an innocuous study group, and now the rest of this is hearsay. In fact, all this is hearsay, I guess. They were told, don't call us, we call you. You've been working too hard. And basically, hearsay again, he said to the 4 stars, if you want to end this war, take those B-52s, take them to Hanoi, and let's do the whole plan again. And I think what they decided not to do that, and I think their reason being, if the Chinese come across the border, we got another North Vietnamese, we had another Korea on our hands. Okay. He laid it on the line the way he thought it should be. He had his head handed to him, and his career went down the tubes. But had we done that in 1968, then we would have lost about 50,000 less lives and saved billions of dollars and walked out of there with our heads held high. And I fault our senior leadership for not doing that, and I can't help but think if General LeMay had been Chief of Staff of the Air Force at the time, he would have gone to the President, which would have been his legal right to do, and tell the President exactly what we should have done. Next slide. Again, that's my own personal opinion. Okay, analysis where Albert's going to do, could that have happened? And it's important because in 1968, that air defense system was not as lethal as it was in 72, and a lot of lives would have been saved. Next slide. Now, he's going to take that CIA Twix, and he's going to ask those particular questions. How are we doing in time, Tricia? Okay, 5 minutes. Okay, next slide. He's going to look at Kissinger's secret visit to China. By the way, we gave China some intelligence information that indicated that Russia was going to attack China on their borders. Nixon goes to France, talks to Pompidou. It is alleged he gave the message to tell the North Vietnamese, we're going to do whatever it takes to get our prisoners of war back. Next slide. Now, Nixon has a meeting with the Chinese, and did the conversation come up where he got a promise from from Chinese if we went in to bomb with 52s, they would not intervene. And we set up a U.S. listening post in China, which not too many people know about, and we spied on the Russians and gave the Chinese the results of that. Next slide. After a linebacker 2, we have a peace agreement. Rather interesting thing that people have not figured out to this day. There was a big production made of Kissinger's visit there to the point he was given the honors that would be normally given to a chief of state, a head of state, a friendly state for China. And China doesn't do this for any reason. Why did they do it? One of the things he's going to do, did Kissinger deliver some promise that he made to the Chinese, and that's why they gave him this thing, like ending the war? Was there a secret agreement between China and the United States? And did this agreement imply or promise that if North Vietnam broke its peace treaty with us, China would intervene against North Vietnam? Next slide. Okay, but we have Blinko comes to the west with the 25. He has on his person hard intelligence that indicates that a war with China and Russia could be imminent. What influence does this have on foreign policy? We have the China-Vietnam border war, and what was that all about? Next slide. Now, key question. Did Kissinger talk Nixon into ending linebacker 2? And if so, why did he do it? Was he more interested in getting his Nobel Peace Prize than winning the Vietnam War? And did we, in fact, snatch defeat out of the jaws of victory by stopping Linebacker 2? And hopefully Albert, through his research, and it's going to take years, can answer that question for us. Next slide. So if you have any questions or have anything you think might add, Dr. Atkins and I will be outside, but this is how you can contact him, and he'll be glad to talk to you if something comes up later that he has done, and we'll be glad to answer any questions you have. And I think, how much time have I got, Trish? Oh, I'm out of time. Okay, well, listen, I'm sorry I wanted to open up comments, but I want to thank you very much for being patient, and I'll throw a lot to you, but I want to say to all of you again, thank you very much for, particularly you Linebacker 2 participants, for what you did for your country. You did a great job, and I salute you for doing it.